So guys, today I'm going to give you my answer to that question that uncles and aunties ask you when you reject something unhealthy at their house and they feel like it's their divine duty to make sure that you eat it. And that question is, beta itne sochte kyun ho, khao piyo mast raho. And now for you non-Hindi speakers, that basically means YOLO, eat what you want, be happy. My answer to this question is that indulgent food is merely pleasure. It is not mast raho or a general state of happiness. Rather, constantly giving into that urge to eat unhealthy food leads you into the pleasure trap of food. So the experience of pleasure is a result of activity of the dopamine system. When we find something pleasurable, it's because our body is releasing dopamine, and basically what our body is saying to us is, we want more of that. Give us more of that. It's kind of rewarding you for doing the activity you're doing. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, the dopamine system is meant to guide you towards things that help you meet your evolutionary purpose. That is to survive long enough to pass on your genes. Now, that has two main elements: survival and passing on your genes. Survival, the main component is obviously food, so it guides you towards food in that you want to keep sustaining yourself. And then it guides you towards sex, which is the second element, which is passing on your genes. The sense behind this is that if you're able to live long enough and if you're driven to have sex, you're more likely to pass on your genes. So dopamine creates sort of like a positive feedback loop, that when you do activities that are meeting these evolutionary goals, you feel good about it, you get feedback, and it raises an emotion of sort of feeling rewarded. Now, the problem with the dopamine system is that it is an easily hackable system. Cocaine, for example, stimulates your dopamine system, which is why it is so addictive. It keeps you coming back for more. Now, they've done a study where they've actually put a rat in a cage and given it a button, and every time it presses that button, it gets a little hit of cocaine. And what they found was that the rat keeps pressing the button until it dies. And in the period that it's pressing the button till it dies, it completely loses interest in food, reproduction. You can put another female rat in the cage and the rat will not even react to it. It will keep pressing the button until it dies. So this just goes to show that things that surge your dopamine can actually throw off your dopamine system. Now, in the context of food, the problem with dopamine arises with heavily processed foods. Now, heavily processed food is basically when you take a food, say a whole food, and you just strip away layers of it and refine it and put it in its simplest form. So refined foods, you basically take away all the essential digestive requirements that you have. So you remove the fiber, you remove the water, because these have a high digestive load, and you just leave things like the simple carbohydrates behind or refined oils behind. So these sort of over-refined foods also lead to a spike in dopamine. Now, you have to understand that so does regular food, but when you over-refine the food and it becomes so palatable, then it spikes your dopamine even more. The reason it is palatable is because it stimulates your dopamine system so aggressively. So to understand this principle of the dopamine spike with food, I would like to show you this graph. Now, in phase 1 of this graph, the person is eating whole foods and they're getting a dopamine response from eating the food. Your body is rewarding you for eating because it needs to drive you towards that behavior. So when you eat the whole foods, you have a normal dopamine response. In phase 2, you're eating heavily processed foods that have far more calories per bite, and every time you take a bite, you're getting a surge of dopamine that's above the normal level. But now you would ask me, why can't I just eat unhealthy and, be happy? Maybe I'll live a shorter life, I'll have, diabetes or whatever, but at least I'll be happy. The problem with that is that the nature of pleasure itself is temporary. It's not like if you keep eating unhealthy food, the pleasure is just an upward curve. Eventually it flattens out and then it starts to dip. So when you eat these foods for too long, your body habituates to these foods at a neural level. Your dopamine system cannot just go on endlessly releasing dopamine and you feeling great all the time. If there's too much of dopamine being released on a regular basis, your dopamine receptors dull and your ability to feel good from that food actually goes down. Now you're in the later stages of phase 2, and what's happening is that you're no longer getting the same amount of pleasure from food. You overconsume calories on a regular basis. You're overweight, you have diabetes, you're unhealthy, and you're not necessarily living a more pleasurable life. To make matters even worse, eating healthy food now even feels worse. The dopamine response that you initially had, the normal level dopamine response that you had from eating whole foods, is now less. So when you eat whole foods, it actually feels like you're doing something wrong. It gives you absolutely no pleasure at all. So this is essentially the issue with falling into the pleasure trap of food. You start eating food merely because it provides you pleasure, but then after a while that pleasure tapers off and now you're unhealthy, and it's even harder now to get back to being healthy. Our body's dopamine system evolved to help us survive in situations of scarcity. We as a species love to eat high calorie foods because we evolved in situations where food was hard to come by. So whenever you did come across food, and especially if it was high calorie food, you wanted to eat as much as you can. This is partially why your stomach is such a stretchy organ. You can stuff it with food when there was times of abundance, but then when there was times of scarcity, you have all that body fat that's basically stored energy that will help you get through those periods of scarcity. So in that situation, our dopamine system was handy. It kept telling us eat more, and eat more fatty, sugary foods. But now the situation is flipped. Since the Industrial Revolution, we don't have a problem of scarcity. We have a problem of abundance. And our dopamine system, which was optimal for situations of scarcity, is having to operate in this new environment. Now we have unlimited access to foods, especially palatable foods that are high in calories and low in nutritional value. Therefore, don't get caught in the pleasure trap of food or the pleasure trap of anything. Allow yourself a piece of cake, but not every day. Once in a while. There's nothing wrong with seeking out pleasurable activities. It's a part of life and it's part of what makes life enriching. But when you make your life just about seeking out pleasurable activities, you'll find that the pleasure that you get from that will eventually diminish. And understand that there's a distinction between pleasure and happiness. Pleasure is a never-ending pursuit that you feel for moments and then crave more of, whereas happiness is simply a state of being. It's a way of existing. So guys, I hope you find this video interesting, and I hope it motivates you to stay on your diet, because some people think that they're giving up on happiness when they're eating a particular way, when they're eating clean and looking after themselves. But what they don't realize is that they're actually contributing towards their happiness. Eating well is part of feeling good. What you put in your body is a huge part of how you feel. And if you keep putting trash in your body in the pursuit of pleasure, you're going to feel like trash. That's all for today's video, guys. I hope you found it useful. I'll catch you guys next time. Cheers.